The conference room fell silent as Admiral Richardson's voice cut through the air like a blade. His weathered face twisted with disdain as he looked down at the young woman sitting across from him.
At barely 5 feet tall, with innocent brown eyes and a soft voice, she seemed completely out of place among the decorated military officers surrounding the mahogany table. "You little brat," he sneered, his medals catching the harsh fluorescent light.
What could you possibly know about real combat? What the Admiral didn't know was that he had just insulted the most lethal woman in the United States Navy, a ghost who had eliminated high-value targets in 13 countries, a phantom who had saved the lives of countless American soldiers without them ever knowing her name, a legend whispered about in the darkest corners of military intelligence. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she was about to remind everyone in that room why some secrets are worth keeping. Sarah Chen adjusted her plain black glasses and smoothed down her conservative navy blazer as she walked through the corridors of the Pentagon. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another junior intelligence analyst heading to another boring briefing. Her small frame and quiet demeanor made her practically invisible among the towering military officers who strode past her with purpose and authority. The morning sun streamed through the high windows as Sarah made her way to Conference Room 3A, clutching a manila folder containing intelligence reports that could change the course of military operations in Southeast Asia. She had spent 3 sleepless nights analyzing satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and human intelligence reports to piece together a puzzle that had stumped entire departments. As she entered the conference room, the conversations died down. 12 high-ranking military officials turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to barely concealed irritation. Admiral Richardson sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his chest heavy with ribbons and medals earned over 3 decades of naval service. His steel-gray eyes fixed on Sarah with the kind of look reserved for interruptions during important meetings. "Gentlemen," announced Colonel Martinez, who had requested Sarah's presence, "this is Intelligence Analyst Chen from the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Division. She has some findings regarding Operation Seahawk that I believe warrant our attention." Sarah felt the weight of their collective gaze as she moved to the presentation screen.
Her hands remained steady despite the intimidating audience. She had faced far more dangerous situations than a room full of skeptical officers, though none of them could possibly know that.
Admiral Richardson leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers drumming impatiently on the polished table. "Colonel, with all due respect, we have senior intelligence officials who have already briefed us on Seahawk.
I'm not sure what a junior analyst could add to our understanding of such a complex operation." The dismissive tone wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Several officers nodded in agreement, clearly viewing Sarah's presence as a waste of their valuable time. They saw a young woman who looked like she belonged in a university library rather than in a room where life and death decisions were made. Sarah cleared her throat softly and began connecting her laptop to the projection system. "Admiral Richardson, sir, I understand your concerns about time efficiency. However, I've identified several critical intelligence gaps in the current operational planning that could result in catastrophic failure and significant loss of American lives." Her voice was calm and professional, but there was an undertone of confidence that made Admiral Richardson's eyebrows raise slightly. Still, his expression remained skeptical. "Intelligence gaps," he scoffed. "Young lady, the intelligence for Operation Seahawk has been reviewed by some of the most experienced analysts in the military. Are you suggesting that you've discovered something that teams of seasoned professionals have missed?" Sarah nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. That's exactly what I'm suggesting." A murmur rippled through the room. Several officers exchanged glances, some amused by what they perceived as youthful arrogance, others intrigued by her unwavering confidence. General Harrison, a decorated Army veteran, leaned forward. "Miss Chen, I've been reading intelligence reports since before you were born. What makes you think you found something we've overlooked?" Sarah clicked to her first slide, which displayed a satellite image of the target area. "General, with respect, experience is invaluable, but sometimes fresh eyes can spot patterns that become invisible through familiarity. The intelligence reports provided to you focus on the primary target compound, but they fail to account for a secondary installation that wasn't properly identified." She used a laser pointer to highlight a seemingly innocuous cluster of buildings about 2 miles from the main target. Standard analysis classified these structures as civilian housing, but cross-referencing thermal imaging data from multiple passes over the past 6 weeks reveals activity patterns inconsistent with residential use. Admiral Richardson's expression grew more skeptical. Miss asked, "Chen, are you seriously suggesting that professional satellite imagery analysts misidentified basic building types,
These people have been doing this job for decades. No, sir, Sarah replied evenly. I'm suggesting that the analysis was incomplete. The thermal signatures show concentrated activity during hours when residential areas should be dormant, and the electromagnetic emissions detected in this sector indicate sophisticated communications equipment far beyond what civilian populations would require. She advanced to the next slide showing detailed thermal imaging data overlaid with timestamps.
The room grew quieter as the officers studied the information. Colonel Williams, the operations planning officer, frowned as he examined the data.
Even if you're correct about this secondary site, it doesn't significantly impact our operational planning. Our primary objective remains unchanged. Sarah shook her head.
Sir, that's where the critical intelligence gap becomes apparent. This secondary installation isn't just a support facility. Based on the communication intercepts I've analyzed, it serves as a coordination hub for a much larger network than previously understood. She clicked to the next slide, revealing a complex web of communication patterns.
The intercepts show coded transmissions occurring precisely 12 minutes before each scheduled supply run to the primary target. This secondary site isn't just supporting the main compound. It's providing early warning and coordination for a network that extends across at least 4 provinces.
The room fell silent as the implications became clear. If Sarah was correct, the planned operation wouldn't just be targeting a single isolated facility, but potentially walking into a coordinated response from a much larger enemy network.
Admiral Richardson studied the data more carefully, his initial skepticism giving way to professional interest. Ms. Chen, assuming your analysis is accurate, what are you recommending?
Sir, I recommend immediate reconnaissance of the secondary site and a complete revision of operational timing. The current plan calls for approach during the pre-dawn hours, but that coincides with the most active communication periods for this coordination network. A daylight approach, counterintuitive as it might seem, would occur during their documented dormant periods. General Harrison looked up from his notes. You're suggesting we throw out months of planning based on communication patterns you've identified in a few days of analysis? Sarah met his gaze steadily. General, I'm suggesting we adapt our planning based on intelligence that could prevent our forces from walking into a coordinated ambush. The communication patterns I've identified show response times of less than 8 minutes from alert to full mobilization across multiple sites. The weight of her words settled over the room. 8 minutes was far less time than the operation had accounted for, and the implications for the safety of American forces were serious.
Commander Peterson, who had been silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke up. Ms.
Chen, you seem very confident in your analysis. What's your background in tactical intelligence assessment?
It was a loaded question, and everyone in the room knew it.
Sarah's official record showed her as a junior analyst with a computer science degree and 2 years of desk duty. To these seasoned officers, she appeared to be a recent graduate who had stumbled upon some interesting data but lacked the experience to properly interpret its significance. Sarah paused for just a moment, choosing her words carefully. Commander, my background is in pattern recognition and signal analysis. I may not have decades of field experience, but I have extensive training in identifying anomalies in complex datasets. Admiral Richardson leaned forward, his tone becoming more aggressive. Chen, pattern recognition is one thing, but tactical assessment requires understanding how enemy forces actually operate in combat situations. Have you ever been in a combat zone? Have you ever seen how quickly situations can deteriorate when intelligence estimates prove incorrect? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could feel the tension in the room as the officers waited for her response. They expected her to admit her limitations, to acknowledge that despite her interesting analysis, she lacked the real-world experience to understand the full implications of what she was proposing. Instead, Sarah straightened slightly and met Admiral Richardson's intimidating stare. Admiral, I understand your concern about experience. However, the data doesn't require field experience to interpret. It requires analytical precision. And the precision of this analysis could mean the difference between mission success and losing American lives. Her calm confidence in the face of the Admiral's intimidation seemed to irritate him further. He had spent his career commanding respect through rank and experience, and this young woman's refusal to be cowed by his authority struck him as disrespectful. Young lady, Admiral Richardson said, his voice taking on a harder edge. Analytical precision is meaningless without operational context.
You're sitting in a room with officers who have planned and executed complex operations across multiple theaters of conflict. We understand the realities of combat in ways that computer analysis simply cannot capture.
Sarah nodded respectfully. Sir, I'm not questioning anyone's operational experience. I'm simply presenting intelligence that wasn't available during the original planning phase.
The communication intercepts I've analyzed were only declassified for analyst review 3 days ago.
3 days? General Harrison interjected. You're basing operational recommendations on 3 days of analysis? No, sir, Sarah replied. I'm basing recommendations on analysis of data spanning 6 weeks, but which was only made available for comprehensive review 3 days ago.
The patterns I've identified are consistent and significant. Admiral Richardson's patience was clearly wearing thin.
The combination of Sarah's youth, her apparent inexperience, and her unwavering confidence in contradicting months of established planning struck him as presumptuous arrogance. Big and gray. Chen, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I think you're failing to grasp the complexity of military operations. This isn't a computer simulation where you can adjust variables and predict outcomes. This is real warfare with real consequences. Your academic approach to intelligence analysis might work in a classroom, but it doesn't translate to operational reality. The insult was clear to everyone in the room. Admiral Richardson wasn't just questioning Sarah's analysis. He was dismissing her as an inexperienced academic playing at military intelligence.
Sarah's expression remained composed, but something flickered in her eyes that none of the officers quite caught.
Admiral, I understand the gravity of operational decisions.
I'm not approaching this as an academic exercise. I'm presenting intelligence that could prevent casualties among our forces. Admiral Richardson stood up from his chair, using his full height to emphasize the power dynamic in the room. His voice grew louder, taking on the commanding tone he used when addressing subordinates who had overstepped their bounds. Ms.
Chen, let me make something perfectly clear. Military planning is not about interesting patterns in datasets.
It's about understanding enemy capabilities, terrain analysis, logistical coordination, and 100 other factors that require years of experience to properly evaluate.
You may have found some anomalies in communication intercepts, but that doesn't qualify you to question operational plans developed by some of the most experienced military minds in the country. The room was completely silent now. Every officer present could feel the tension building as Admiral Richardson's frustration reached a boiling point. This was clearly a man who was not accustomed to having his judgment questioned, especially by someone he viewed as a junior analyst with delusions of importance.
Sarah remained standing calmly beside the projection screen, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing figure of the Admiral. To the other officers in the room, the contrast was stark, the seasoned military leader with decades of experience facing down a young woman who seemed almost fragile in comparison.
Admiral Richardson took a step closer, his face flushed with anger and frustration. His voice dropped to a menacing growl that had intimidated countless subordinates over the years. "You little brat," he sneered, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "What could you possibly know about real combat?" The insult landed in the room like a physical blow. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing that Admiral Richardson had crossed a line from professional disagreement into personal attack. The dismissive, contemptuous tone left no doubt about his opinion of Sarah and her contributions to the briefing.
But as the Admiral glared down at Sarah, expecting to see her crumble under his intimidation, something unexpected happened. Instead of the embarrassed retreat he anticipated, Sarah's expression remained perfectly composed.
If anything, there was a slight change in her posture, a subtle shift that spoke of coiled strength rather than intimidation. For just a moment, the officers in the room caught a glimpse of something that didn't quite fit with the junior analyst persona.
There was a stillness about Sarah that spoke of absolute confidence, a quality that seemed at odds with someone who should have been overwhelmed by the Admiral's verbal assault. Sarah looked directly into Admiral Richardson's eyes, her voice remaining calm and professional despite the personal attack.
"Admiral, my knowledge of combat comes from sources that aren't reflected in my official personnel file." The statement was simple, but something in the way she said it made several officers pay closer attention. There was an undertone of absolute certainty that seemed incongruous with her apparent position and experience. Admiral Richardson, however, was too caught up in his anger to notice the subtle warning signals. He interpreted her response as continued defiance, further proof of her arrogant refusal to acknowledge her limitations.
"Sources, not in your file?" He laughed harshly.
What sources could a junior intelligence analyst possibly have that would give you insight into combat operations? Did you read about it in books? Watch documentaries. The mockery in his voice was unmistakable. He was enjoying the opportunity to put this presumptuous young woman in her place, to demonstrate to everyone in the room why experience and rank mattered more than clever analysis.
A cold breeze dinnies and punches and motors in itself.
Sarah tilted her head slightly, and for the first time since entering the room she smiled. It wasn't the nervous smile of someone being intimidated. It was something else entirely. Something that made Colonel Martinez, who had worked with classified personnel files, suddenly look very concerned. "Admiral Richardson," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying a new quality that hadn't been there during her intelligence briefing. "I think there might be some information about my background that you're not aware of." Colonel Martinez felt his stomach drop as he watched the exchange between Admiral Richardson and Sarah Chen.
There was something in Sarah's tone, a subtle shift in her demeanor, that triggered alarm bells in his mind. As the officer who had requested Sarah's presence at the briefing, he suddenly realized he might have made a catastrophic mistake in not fully reviewing her classified personnel records. The smile on Sarah's face wasn't one of nervousness or submission. It was the kind of smile that spoke of secrets and capabilities that most people in the room couldn't begin to imagine.
Colonel Martinez had seen that expression before, in the eyes of operators who had been places and done things that would never appear in official reports. Admiral Richardson, still caught up in his anger and sense of superiority, completely missed the warning signs.
He saw Sarah's smile as further evidence of her arrogance, proof that she refused to accept her place in the military hierarchy. "Information about your background?" Admiral Richardson scoffed.
"Whoopsid.
Miss Chen, your personnel file is quite clear.
Computer science degree from Stanford. 2 years as a junior intelligence analyst. No field experience. No combat deployments. What possible information could change the fact that you're completely unqualified to question the operational decisions of experienced military leaders?" Sarah's smile widened slightly, and she glanced around the room at the assembled officers.
Most of them were watching the confrontation with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, clearly expecting to witness the complete humiliation of an overconfident junior analyst. But a few of the more experienced officers were beginning to sense that something wasn't quite right about the situation.
General Harrison, who had spent decades reading people and situations, found himself studying Sarah more carefully. There was something about her physical presence that didn't match her supposed background.
The way she held herself, the absolute steadiness of her hands during what should have been an intensely stressful confrontation, spoke of training and experience that went far beyond computer analysis. "Admiral," Sarah said, her voice taking on a different quality entirely, "my official personnel file contains only the information that's appropriate for my current cover assignment. My actual background is somewhat more extensive." The word "cover" fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Several officers straightened in their chairs, suddenly paying much closer attention to the conversation. Cover assignments were the domain of special operations, intelligence operatives, and people who worked in the shadows of military operations. Admiral Richardson's face darkened further. He interpreted Sarah's words as an escalation of her defiance, possibly even an attempt to fabricate credentials to support her position. "Cover assignment," he roared. "Are you seriously trying to claim that you're some kind of undercover operative?
That your junior analyst position is just an act?" His voice dripped with sarcasm and disbelief. "This is exactly the kind of delusional thinking I'd expect from someone with no real understanding of how military operations actually work." But Colonel Martinez was no longer listening to Admiral Richardson's tirade.
He was pulling out his secure phone, rapidly typing in codes to access classified personnel databases that required the highest levels of security clearance. His hands moved with urgent precision as he navigated through layers of classified information, searching for Sarah Chen's complete military record. The first level of classification showed exactly what Admiral Richardson had described: a junior intelligence analyst with a computer science background. But Colonel Martinez had access to deeper levels, the kind of classification that revealed information about special operations personnel, covert operatives, and people whose real identities were protected by multiple layers of security. As Colonel Martinez accessed the next level of classification, his face went pale. The information that appeared on his screen was so far removed from Sarah's official cover identity that it took him several moments to process what he was reading. Sarah Chen wasn't just an intelligence analyst. According to the classified records, she was a Navy SEAL with the designation SO1, indicating the highest level of special operations training. But even more shocking was her operational history. 13 confirmed high-value target eliminations across 4 different theaters of operation, 3 successful hostage rescue missions in hostile territory, and a service record that read like a catalog of the most dangerous and sensitive operations conducted by American Special Forces over the past 5 years.
Colonel Martinez looked up from his phone to see Sarah watching him with that same knowing smile. She had clearly noticed his search through the classified databases and was waiting to see how he would handle the revelation.
"Admiral Richardson," Colonel Martinez said quietly, his voice cutting through the heated exchange. "Sir, I think you need to see something." The Admiral turned toward Colonel Martinez, clearly annoyed by the interruption.
"Colonel, Whatever it is can wait. I'm in the middle of explaining to Ms. Chen why junior analysts don't get to redesign military operations. Sir, Colonel Martinez said more urgently, holding up his secure phone. You really need to see this immediately. Something in Colonel Martinez's tone finally penetrated Admiral Richardson's anger. The colonel's face had gone completely white, and his hands were visibly shaking as he held the phone.
This wasn't the demeanor of someone who had discovered an interesting piece of information. This was the reaction of someone who had just realized they were in the presence of something far more significant than they had understood. Admiral Richardson strode over to Colonel Martinez and took the phone, squinting at the small screen.
As his eyes moved across the classified information, his expression underwent a dramatic transformation. The anger and contempt disappeared, replaced first by confusion, then by dawning comprehension, and finally by something approaching shock.
The phone displayed Sarah Chen's real military record, complete with classified mission reports, commendation letters from the highest levels of command, and operational assessments that painted a picture of someone who was not just competent in combat situations, but legendary within the special operations community. One entry in particular caught Admiral Richardson's attention, a mission report from 18 months earlier, in which Sarah had single-handedly eliminated a terrorist cell that had been holding 3 American diplomats hostage.
The operation had taken place in urban terrain under conditions that military analysts had deemed nearly impossible for successful extraction. Sarah had completed the mission without losing a single hostage and had exfiltrated from hostile territory through 200 miles of enemy-controlled terrain.
Another report detailed her role in a joint operation with British SAS forces to neutralize a weapons trafficking network that had been supplying advanced explosives to insurgent groups. According to the operational assessment, Sarah's tactical planning and execution had been so effective that the British command had requested her permanent assignment to their Special Operations Task Force. Admiral Richardson's hands began to shake as he continued reading.
The woman he had just dismissed as an inexperienced analyst had a combat record that surpassed most of the officers in the room. Her operational history included missions in environments ranging from Arctic conditions to desert warfare to urban combat scenarios that would challenge the most elite military units.
But perhaps most shocking of all was her unofficial designation within the special operations community, Ghost. The reports indicated that enemy forces had developed almost mythical beliefs about her capabilities, often abandoning positions simply based on intelligence suggesting she might be operating in their area. As Admiral Richardson looked up from the phone, he found Sarah watching him with patient expectation. The other officers in the room sensed that something significant had just occurred, but only Colonel Martinez and now Admiral Richardson understood the full magnitude of the situation.
Miss Chen, Admiral Richardson said, his voice now completely different from the aggressive tone he had used moments before. I believe I may have misunderstood your background. Sarah nodded calmly.
Yes, sir.
That's quite common with cover assignments. They're designed to be convincing. General Harrison, who had been watching the exchange with growing curiosity, finally spoke up.
Could someone please explain what's happening here? Colonel Martinez cleared his throat nervously. General, it appears that Miss
Chen's official personnel file doesn't reflect her complete military background. Her actual service record is classified at levels that require special access.
How classified? Commander Peterson asked. Admiral Richardson looked at Sarah, clearly seeking permission to share information that was far above the security clearance level of most people in the room. Sarah gave a slight nod. Gentlemen, Admiral Richardson said slowly, we are in the presence of a Navy SEAL, with more confirmed successful operations than most Special Forces units complete in their entire existence. Ms. Chen isn't just qualified to assess tactical intelligence. She's one of the most effective operational assets in the American military.
The room fell into stunned silence.
Every officer present was trying to reconcile the quiet, unassuming woman they had dismissed as an inexperienced analyst with the revelation that she was actually one of the most lethal and effective warriors in the United States military. General Harrison was the first to find his voice. Ms. Chen, if you're a Navy SEAL with extensive operational experience, why are you working as an intelligence analyst? Sarah's expression remained professional, but there was a hint of something that might have been amusement in her eyes. General, intelligence analysis is one aspect of my current assignment. My actual role involves identifying operational intelligence that might be missed by conventional analysis, precisely because of my field experience. Commander Peterson leaned forward. When you identified the communication patterns in secondary installation, you weren't just doing data analysis. You were applying operational knowledge. That's correct, sir, Sarah confirmed. The patterns I identified are consistent with early warning networks I've encountered in multiple combat environments. The timing sequences match tactical communication protocols used by organized enemy forces to coordinate responses to perceived threats. The implications of her statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah hadn't just found interesting anomalies in data. She had recognized enemy tactical patterns based on direct combat experience with similar situations. Admiral Richardson set down the classified phone and looked at Sarah with completely new eyes. The young woman he had dismissed as an arrogant analyst was actually a warrior whose combat experience dwarfed his own, despite his decades of military service. Ms. Chen, he said carefully, when you recommended changes to the operational timing and approach vectors, those recommendations were based on your experience with enemy response patterns in similar environments. Yes, sir, Sarah replied. The communication intercepts show coordination patterns identical to networks I've operated against in 3 different theaters. The response times, the frequency coordination, and the backup communication protocols all match documented enemy tactical doctrine for coordinated ambush scenarios. Colonel Williams, who had been silent throughout the revelation, finally spoke up. If you're correct about the enemy coordination capabilities, then our current operational plan would result in our forces walking directly into a prepared kill zone.
Sarah nodded grimly.
That's my assessment, sir. The timing of the planned approach coincides perfectly with the most active coordination periods for the enemy network. They would have advance warning of our approach and sufficient time to position assets for maximum effectiveness against our forces. The weight of her words was crushing. The operation that had been planned for months, the mission that was supposed to be a decisive strike against enemy capabilities, would instead become a trap that could result in catastrophic American casualties. General Harrison rubbed his forehead, clearly struggling to process the situation.
Ms. Chen, you allowed Admiral Richardson and the rest of us to dismiss your analysis and question your qualifications for nearly an hour.
Why didn't you reveal your actual background immediately? Sarah's expression remained neutral, but there was a slight tension around her eyes that suggested the question touched on something sensitive. General, my cover assignment serves several purposes. One of them is to observe how different levels of command respond to intelligence that challenges established plans. Your reactions to my analysis, both positive and negative, provide valuable information about decision-making processes under pressure. The implication was clear and uncomfortable. Sarah hadn't just been presenting intelligence. She had been conducting a psychological assessment of the command structure, evaluating how senior officers responded when their assumptions were challenged by someone they perceived as inferior. Admiral Richardson felt a flush of embarrassment and anger, but this time the anger was directed at himself rather than at Sarah. He realized that his dismissive treatment of her analysis had been based entirely on his assumptions about her background and capabilities, rather than on the merit of the intelligence she was presenting. Chen, Admiral Richardson said slowly. I owe you an apology. My response to your analysis was inappropriate and unprofessional. Sarah tilted her head slightly. Admiral, your response was actually quite valuable for assessment purposes. It demonstrated exactly how enemy forces might expect American command structures to react when presented with intelligence that contradicts established assumptions. Her words were diplomatic, but they carried an unmistakable sting. Admiral Richardson understood that his behavior had been exactly the kind of rigid thinking that could be exploited by enemy forces who understood American military psychology. However, Sarah continued, now that we've established the credibility of the intelligence, I'd like to propose a complete revision of the operational approach. The enemy network I've identified presents both significant challenges and unique opportunities. General Harrison leaned forward with renewed attention. What kind of opportunities? Sarah moved back to the projection screen and advanced to a new slide that showed a complex tactical overlay. If we adjust our approach to account for the coordination network, we can turn their communication capabilities against them. Instead of walking into their trap, we can use their own coordination protocols to feed them false information about our intentions and timing. The slide showed a sophisticated deception plan that would involve multiple phases of misdirection, designed to make the enemy coordination network believe that American forces were approaching from a completely different vector at a different time. The beauty of their sophisticated coordination system, Sarah explained, is that it becomes a vulnerability when we understand how it operates. We can inject false intelligence into their communication network at precisely the right points to cause them to position their assets exactly where we want them. Commander Peterson studied the tactical display with growing amazement. You're proposing that we turn their ambush preparation into our ambush opportunity. Exactly, sir, Sarah confirmed. Instead of trying to avoid their coordination network, We use it to coordinate their forces into positions that give us maximum tactical advantage. The plan was elegant in its complexity and devastating in its implications.
Rather than abandoning months of operational planning, Sarah was proposing that they use the enemy's own capabilities to ensure the mission's success while simultaneously eliminating the threat posed by the broader coordination network. Admiral Richardson studied the tactical display, his mind racing through the implications of what Sarah was proposing.
The plan required a level of tactical sophistication and psychological understanding that went far beyond conventional military operations.
Chen, he said slowly, implementing this kind of deception operation would require someone with extensive experience in psychological operations and enemy network manipulation. Sarah's smile returned, and this time every officer in the room recognized it for what it was, the expression of someone who had capabilities that went far beyond what any of them had imagined.
"Admiral," she said quietly, "that's exactly the kind of operation I've been trained for." 3 weeks later, Sarah Chen crouched in the pre-dawn darkness of the jungle, her face painted with camouflage that rendered her nearly invisible against the dense vegetation. The transformation from the quiet intelligence analyst who had sat in that Pentagon conference room was complete. Here, in her element, she moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of remaining unseen while dealing death to America's enemies. Her earpiece crackled with the voice of Colonel Martinez, who was coordinating the operation from a command center 200 miles away.
Ghost, this is command. All units are in position and awaiting your signal to commence Phase 1 of the deception protocol.
Sarah pressed the transmit button on her throat microphone, her voice barely a whisper. "Command, Ghost is in position.
Beginning electronic infiltration of enemy coordination network in 30 seconds. The device in her hands looked like a standard military tablet, but it contained some of the most advanced electronic warfare capabilities available to American Special Forces. Sarah had spent the past 3 weeks working with Navy intelligence specialists to develop a sophisticated program that would allow her to insert false information directly into the enemy's communication network without their knowledge.
The plan she had outlined in that conference room was now being executed with surgical precision.
Instead of the original frontal assault that would have resulted in catastrophic American casualties, Operation Seahawk had been completely redesigned as a complex deception operation that would turn the enemy's own coordination capabilities against them. Sarah's fingers moved across the tablet's interface with practiced efficiency.
The first phase of the operation required her to hack into the enemy's communication network and begin feeding them false intelligence about American force movements. The information had to be subtle enough to seem like genuine intelligence leaks, but specific enough to cause the enemy to reposition their assets exactly where Sarah wanted them.
Her tablet screen showed a real-time display of enemy communication traffic, the patterns flowing across the screen exactly as she had predicted during her briefing. The coordination network she had identified was operating precisely according to the tactical doctrine she had encountered in previous operations, making their responses predictable to someone with her experience.
Command Ghost has successfully accessed enemy coordination network, Sarah whispered. Initiating Phase 1 intelligence injection. She began typing rapidly, inserting carefully crafted false reports into the enemy communication system. The first message suggested that American reconnaissance units had been detected approaching from the northeast, approximately 6 hours earlier than the enemy expected any assault. The second message indicated that the main American force was significantly larger than intelligence estimates had suggested, requiring a more distributed defensive response. Within minutes, Sarah could see the enemy network responding exactly as she had anticipated. Communication traffic increased dramatically as coordination commanders began repositioning assets to counter the perceived threat from the northeast.
The enemy forces were abandoning their carefully prepared ambush positions and moving to intercept what they believed was an American force approaching from the wrong direction. "Command, enemy forces are responding to Phase 1 deception," Sarah reported. "Observing significant troop movement toward northeastern defensive positions. Phase 2 can commence on schedule." Colonel Martinez's voice came through her earpiece with barely contained excitement. "Outstanding work, Ghost. All units report enemy positions are shifting exactly according to your predictions."
Commencing Phase 2 in 15 minutes. Sarah moved through the jungle with supernatural quietness, her years of training allowing her to navigate the dense undergrowth without disturbing so much as a leaf.
Weird telling the people that they should be bothered as to the second. This is the book. It's about history. She needed to reach the actual enemy coordination center to complete the second phase of her deception operation. This phase would be significantly more dangerous, requiring her to physically infiltrate the enemy compound and manually access their primary communication equipment. The intelligence she had analyzed back in that Pentagon conference room had identified the coordination center as a hardened facility with multiple layers of security. But Sarah had spent 5 years infiltrating similar facilities, and she understood exactly how to exploit the weaknesses that existed in even the most sophisticated defensive systems.
As she approached the perimeter of the coordination center, Sarah could see that her deception was working perfectly. The majority of the facility's security personnel had been redeployed to defensive positions several miles away, leaving only a skeleton crew to protect what the enemy commanders believed was no longer a primary target. Sarah settled into position behind a fallen log and began observing the remaining security patterns. 2 guards patrolled the main entrance on a predictable schedule, while a single sniper position covered the eastern approach to the facility. The western side of the compound was protected only by motion sensors and automated warning systems.
Her tablet showed that the enemy communication network was reaching peak activity levels as commanders struggled to coordinate the repositioning of their forces. This was exactly the moment of maximum distraction that Sarah had been waiting for.
She moved like smoke through the shadows, bypassing the motion sensors using techniques that had been developed through years of practical experience in similar environments. The automated warning systems were designed to detect rapid movement in metallic objects, but Sarah's approach was so slow and deliberate that she remained below their detection thresholds.
Reaching the western wall of the coordination center, Sarah removed a small device from her equipment pack. The device looked like a standard electronic multi-tool, but it contained specialized equipment for bypassing electronic security systems without triggering alarms.
Within 3 minutes, she had created an opening in the facility's security perimeter and slipped inside the compound. The interior of the coordination center buzzed with activity as enemy communication specialists struggled to process the flood of false intelligence that Sarah had injected into their network. Sarah moved through the facility's corridors with the confidence of someone who had done this dozens of times before. Her mental map of the building, constructed from satellite imagery and intelligence reports, proved to be completely accurate as she navigated toward the primary communication center. The communication center itself was a large room filled with sophisticated radio equipment, computer terminals, and monitoring stations. 3 technicians were working frantically at their stations, trying to coordinate the massive troop movements that Sarah's deception had triggered. Sarah observed the room for several minutes, noting the positions of the personnel and the location of the primary communication equipment she needed to access. The technicians were completely focused on their coordination tasks, presenting her with the perfect opportunity to complete her mission. Moving with the silence that had earned her the designation Ghost, Sarah approached the primary communication terminal from behind. The technician operating the terminal was so absorbed in his work that he never sensed her presence until it was far too late. Sarah's attack was swift and precise.
Years of close-quarters combat training had taught her exactly how to neutralize targets without causing noise or disturbance. The technician collapsed unconsciously to the floor, without making a sound. The other 2 technicians remained focused on their stations, completely unaware that their colleague had been eliminated. Sarah quickly accessed the primary communication terminal and began implementing the final phase of her deception operation.
This phase was the most sophisticated part of her plan. Instead of simply feeding false information into the enemy network, Sarah was now taking complete control of their coordination capabilities. She began issuing orders that appeared to come from the enemy's own command structure, directing their forces to positions that would make them completely vulnerable to the American assault that was now approaching from the true vector. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she sent out a series of coordination messages that would cause the enemy forces to abandon their remaining defensive positions and concentrate in an area that offered no tactical advantage and no escape routes.
The beauty of the deception was that each order seemed to be a logical response to the developing tactical situation, making it unlikely that anyone would question the commands until it was far too late. Command, Ghost has achieved complete control of enemy coordination network, Sarah whispered into her throat microphone. Enemy forces are being directed to Consolidation Point Alpha as planned. American assault teams should encounter minimal resistance at primary target. Colonel Martinez's voice came back immediately, filled with admiration and disbelief. Ghost, we're monitoring the enemy repositioning in real time. This is the most effective tactical deception we've ever witnessed. You've turned their entire defensive strategy into a liability.
Sarah continued working at the communication terminal, fine-tuning the orders she was sending to enemy units to ensure maximum effectiveness for the approaching American forces. The enemy coordination network, which had been designed to give them a decisive advantage in defensive operations, had become the instrument of their complete tactical defeat. Through the facility's windows, Sarah could see the first signs of dawn breaking over the jungle. The American assault teams would be beginning their approach within the next 30 minutes, moving against targets that had been stripped of their defensive capabilities by Sarah's psychological manipulation of the enemy coordination network. But Sarah's mission wasn't complete yet. The final phase required her to eliminate the coordination center itself.
ensuring that the enemy could not regain communication control once they realized they had been deceived.
This would involve placing demolition charges throughout the facility and eliminating any remaining personnel who might be able to restore enemy coordination capabilities. She moved through the facility methodically, placing small but highly effective explosive charges at critical points throughout the communication infrastructure. Each charge was positioned to cause maximum disruption to the enemy's ability to coordinate their forces, while also creating enough confusion to prevent them from understanding how completely they had been outmaneuvered.
As Sarah placed the final demolition charge, she heard footsteps approaching the communication center. One of the remaining technicians had apparently noticed the absence of his colleague and was coming to investigate.
Sarah positioned herself beside the doorway, her combat knife ready for immediate use. When the technician entered the room, she eliminated him with the same swift efficiency she had demonstrated throughout her infiltration of the facility.
Command, Ghost has eliminated all personnel in the coordination center and placed demolition charges throughout the facility, she whispered, preparing for extraction and detonation sequence. Understood, Ghost, Colonel Martinez replied.
American assault teams are 10 minutes from target engagement. Execute extraction and detonation at your discretion. Sarah took one final look at the communication equipment she had used to orchestrate the complete tactical destruction of the enemy force. The operation had been a masterpiece of psychological warfare, turning the enemy's greatest strength into the mechanism of their defeat. She slipped out of the facility as silently as she had entered, moving through the jungle toward her predetermined extraction point. When she was safely beyond the blast radius, Sarah activated the detonation sequence. The explosions that tore through the coordination center were carefully timed to create maximum psychological impact.
The simultaneous destruction of multiple communication nodes would leave the enemy forces completely cut off from any form of coordination, making them easy targets for the approaching American assault teams. As Sarah moved through the jungle toward her extraction point, her earpiece filled with reports from the American assault teams.
The primary target compound, which had been expected to offer fierce resistance, had been found virtually undefended. The enemy forces that should have been protecting the facility had been lured away by Sarah's deception, leaving only a handful of personnel who were quickly overwhelmed.
Ghost, this is Alpha Team Leader, came the voice of the assault commander. Primary target has been secured with 0 American casualties. This is the cleanest operation we've ever executed. Whatever you did to their coordination network was absolutely devastating. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she continued toward the extraction helicopter that would take her away from the operation zone. Alpha Team, Ghost is pleased to hear of your success. The enemy coordination network proved to be less resilient than they had anticipated. It was a masterful understatement. Sarah had not just eliminated the enemy's coordination capabilities, she had turned their entire defensive strategy against them, using their own communication network to orchestrate their complete tactical defeat.
As the extraction helicopter lifted off from the jungle clearing, Sarah looked down at the smoke rising from the destroyed coordination center. The operation would be classified at the highest levels, and her role in its success would remain hidden behind layers of security that protected the identities and methods of America's most effective special operations personnel.
By the time the helicopter reached the command center, reports were already coming in from across the entire operational area. The enemy network that had taken months to establish and had posed such a significant threat to American forces had been completely eliminated in a single night of operations. Colonel Martinez was waiting for Sarah when she arrived at the command center, his expression mixing professional admiration with personal amazement.
Ghost, I've been involved in military operations for 25 years, and I've never seen anything approaching the tactical effectiveness of what you accomplished tonight. Sarah removed her combat gear and began the process of transitioning back to her cover identity as a junior intelligence analyst.
Colonel, the operation succeeded because we properly understood the enemy's capabilities and turned them into vulnerabilities. That's the essence of effective intelligence analysis. Colonel Martinez shook his head in wonder. Sarah, what you did tonight wasn't just intelligence analysis. That was artistic warfare. You didn't just defeat the enemy. You made them defeat themselves. Later that morning, Sarah Chen sat in the same Pentagon conference room where Admiral Richardson had dismissed her as an inexperienced analyst just 3 weeks earlier. She was once again wearing her conservative blazer and plain glasses, looking exactly like the junior intelligence analyst that served as her official identity. Admiral Richardson entered the room accompanied by several of the same officers who had witnessed their original confrontation. But the dynamic in the room was completely different now. Every officer present understood exactly who Sarah Chen really was and what she was capable of accomplishing. Ms. Chen, Admiral Richardson said as he took his seat at the head of the table, I wanted to personally thank you for the success of Operation Seahawk. The after-action reports indicate that your tactical assessment and operational planning resulted in the complete elimination of the enemy network with 0 American casualties. Sarah nodded respectfully.
Thank you, Admiral. The operation succeeded because the intelligence analysis identified vulnerabilities that could be exploited through non-conventional tactical approaches. Admiral Richardson studied her for a moment, clearly still struggling to reconcile the quiet analyst sitting before him with the legendary warrior whose capabilities had been demonstrated so devastatingly just hours earlier. Ms. Chen, he said carefully, I find myself curious about something. During our original meeting, when I questioned your qualifications and made inappropriate comments about your background, you had every opportunity to reveal your actual credentials and put me in my place. Instead, you allowed me to continue making a fool of myself. Why? Sarah's expression remained professional, but there was a hint of something that might have been amusement in her eyes.
Admiral, revealing operational capabilities prematurely can compromise mission effectiveness. It's often more valuable to allow people to maintain their assumptions until the moment when accurate understanding becomes tactically necessary. The statement was diplomatic, but everyone in the room understood its implications. Sarah had allowed Admiral Richardson to reveal his own prejudices and limitations, because that information was useful for her assessment of command decision-making processes. General Harrison leaned forward. Ms. said, Chen, if you don't mind me asking, how many operations like this have you been involved in? Sarah was quiet for a moment, clearly considering how much information she could share. General, my operational history includes missions across multiple theaters and conflict types.
The specific number is classified, but I can say that each operation has contributed to my understanding of enemy tactical psychology and coordination vulnerabilities. It was a careful non-answer that revealed nothing while confirming everything.
Sarah Chen was not just an exceptional warrior, she was a legend whose operational history was so extensive and so sensitive that most of the details would never be officially acknowledged. Admiral Richardson stood up from his chair, and this time his movement was not one of intimidation but of respect.
Miss Chen, on behalf of everyone in this room, and everyone whose lives you've saved through your service, I want to apologize for my earlier conduct and thank you for your dedication to protecting American forces and interests.
Sarah stood as well, her small frame still dwarfed by the imposing figure of the Admiral, but now everyone in the room understood that physical stature had absolutely no relationship to tactical capability or operational effectiveness. Admiral, she said quietly, your apology is appreciated, but unnecessary.
Your initial reaction provided valuable intelligence about command psychology that proved useful during operational planning.
As the meeting concluded and the officers began filing out of the conference room, Admiral Richardson lingered behind.
When he and Sarah were alone, he looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and respect that hadn't been present during their first encounter.
Miss.
Chen, he said, I have to ask you something that's been bothering me since I read your classified service record. You've accomplished things that most people would consider impossible. You've saved lives, eliminated threats, and executed operations that will never be publicly acknowledged. Yet you spend your days sitting in briefing rooms allowing people like me to question your qualifications. Doesn't that frustrate you? Sarah considered the question for a moment before answering. Admiral, the most effective operations are the ones that nobody knows happened. The most successful warriors are the ones whose names are never spoken. My job isn't to receive recognition. It's to ensure that American forces can operate successfully and American citizens can sleep safely. She paused, looking directly into Admiral Richardson's eyes. Every time someone like you questions my qualifications based on assumptions about my background, you provide me with valuable information about how our enemies might underestimate American capabilities. Admiral Richardson nodded slowly, beginning to understand the complex psychology of someone who operated in the shadows where individual recognition was not just unimportant but potentially dangerous. Chen, he said, I hope you know that despite the classified nature of your work, there are people who understand and appreciate what you do for this country. Sarah's smile returned, but this time it was warmer and more genuine than the knowing expression she had worn during their confrontation. Admiral, that means more than you might think. As Admiral Richardson left the conference room, Sarah remained behind for a few moments, looking out the window at the Pentagon's courtyard. Tomorrow, she would return to her cover identity as a junior intelligence analyst, sitting in briefing rooms and allowing people to underestimate her capabilities while she gathered the information necessary to protect American forces around the world. In a few weeks or months, there would be another crisis that required her unique combination of analytical skills and operational experience. There would be another enemy network to infiltrate, another
impossible mission to accomplish, another opportunity to turn America's adversaries' strengths against them.
And when that time came, Sarah Chen would once again transform from the quiet analyst into the ghost, the legend who moved through enemy territory like death itself, ensuring that those who threatened American lives learned too late that some secrets are more dangerous than others. The little brat that Admiral Richardson had sneered at was, in fact, one of America's most lethal and effective protectors.
And in a world where the most dangerous enemies were the ones you never saw coming, having someone like Sarah Chen working in the shadows was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The Admiral had learned that lesson the hard way, but he had learned it well.
And in a complex world of modern warfare, that education and the dangers of underestimating quiet professionals might prove to be one of the most valuable intelligence briefings of his entire career.